All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Tonight's Torah portion, we actually have a double Torah portion this week. We have the Torah portion of Behar, which speaks primarily about the Shemitah laws, the sabbatical year, which we'll get to in a moment. And the second Torah portion this week is Bechukosai, or Bechukosai, using the Ashkenazic accent. Which talks about various laws, and we will get to that in a moment. We will zero in on the second Torah portion, and as a matter of fact, we will analyze the first word of the second Torah portion. The name of the Torah portion, and not the first word of the Torah portion, but the name of the Torah portion. But before we do that, let's go through the overview, a quick overview of this week's Torah portion, and we will get right into our topic. The first Torah portion, Behar, begins with, on the mountain of Sinai, God communicates to Moses the laws of the sabbatical year, which are that every seventh year, all work on the land should cease, and its produce becomes free for the taking for all, man and beast. These laws are still practiced till today in the Holy Land of Israel. The sabbatical year happens every seventh year. 7 sabbatical cycles are followed by a 50th year, the Jubilee year, on which work on the land ceases. All indentured servants are set free, and all ancestral estates in the Holy Land that have been sold revert to their original owners. The law of the Jubilee year is not practiced during the time of exile. The law of the Jubilee year is only when the Jews are all in Israel, which isn't during the time of exile. And so, God willing, the law will be back in effect with the coming of Mashiach, may it be speedily in our times. As a matter of fact, the word Jubilee comes from the Hebrew word Yovel. Yovel is the technical term for this 50th year. That's where the term Jubilee comes from. Behar, the first Torah portion, also contains additional laws governing the sale of land and their prohibitions against fraud and usury. God promises that if the people of Israel will keep his commandments, they will enjoy material prosperity and dwell securely in their homeland. But he also delivers a harsh rebuke, warning of the exile, persecution, and other evils that will befall them if they abandon their covenant with him. That is in the Torah portion of Bechukosai. Nevertheless, even when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, nor will I ever abhor them to destroy them and to break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. The parsha concludes with the rules on how to calculate the values of different types of pledges made to God and the mitzvah of tithing produce and livestock. The Torah portion of Bechukosai, the second Torah portion, is actually the final Torah portion of the book of Leviticus. We conclude the book of Leviticus, and next week we begin the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. And so we're looking forward to that. They say the story of a child that comes home and from Hebrew school, and the father, paying all this money for this children's school, says, so Johnny, what'd you learn in school? And he says, we learned all different types of Jewish stuff. So the father thinks for a minute. He figures it's around the time of Shavuot, and he says, so Johnny, who broke the 2 tablets? Johnny, wide-eyed, looks at his dad and says, Dad, it wasn't me. So the father quickly takes Johnny, goes to the Hebrew school, and is shocked at such an answer, and turns to the teacher and says, Mr. Goldstein, Johnny, when I asked him who broke the 2 tablets, he said it wasn't me. So Mr. Goldstein looks at Johnny's father and says, sir, if Johnny, I got to know him. If Johnny is saying he didn't break the 2 tablets, he surely didn't break the 2 tablets. You can be rest assured. Father's not too happy about that. And he takes his child to the principal and takes it up with the principal and says, Mr. Finkelstein, this is what happened. I asked my child who broke it. He said he didn't do it. I came to the teacher, and the teacher said, if I can have his word because he knows Johnny. And if Johnny didn't do it, he didn't do it. Principal looks at the father and says, sir, look, the teacher is honest, and your son, Johnny, is a good boy. If he says he didn't do it, he didn't do it. Send me an invoice for the tablets and I'll pay for them. When it comes to Jewish education, when it comes to Torah study, there are all different types of aspects and angles that we can analyze it from. Socrates famously said that true knowledge exists in knowing that you know nothing. Now, what exactly did he mean by saying that? No one really knows. There's a debate among scholars and philosophers throughout all the ages. But the basic gist of that statement and the idea which it has come to really express is this idea that when someone presumes, a person presumes that they have achieved mastery over a certain topic, really what they have achieved is stunting their own growth in that topic. Because the more one learns, the more we see how much there is yet to learn. And once we recognize that the more we learn, the less we know. The more we learn, the more we see how much more there is to learn, then and only then is there more room to explore and to learn yet even more to gain true knowledge. And so when it comes to the study of Torah, just like it is by any academic study, does this idea apply as well? Is there this idea that we're supposed to approach Torah study as an academic discipline and try to study it to the greatest of our ability in the topics that we know? Are there parts of Torah that we can't understand? Or are there parts of Torah that are beyond our grasp? Are there parts of Torah that are simply too esoteric for us to study? Are there parts of Torah that are too unfamiliar for us and we are too somewhat detached from the spirituality and godliness of it that is too much for us? Or is it all another academic discipline? And so to get to that idea and really what is the purpose of Torah study in and of itself, is it a means to an end or is it an end in itself? We will begin with the first word of this week's Torah portion. Text 1, if you have the books, is on page 69. Quote from this week's Torah portion: if you follow my statutes and observe my commandments and perform them, I will give your rains in their time, the land will yield its produce, and the tree of the field will give forth its fruit. Those are the first two verses of the second Torah portion of this week's Torah reading. The Hebrew word of the name of the Torah portion is Bechukosai. It translates to my statutes. What is it referring to? What is this verse telling us? The verse is telling us that if we heed God's commandments and we follow them, we fulfill the commandments, then God will give us all sorts of blessing. And the verse actually continues with even greater blessings. But if we analyze the word that's used as the first term in this week's Torah portion, it doesn't say my commandments. As a matter of fact, it says my commandments, the second term, mitzvotai, my commandments. What exactly does my statutes refer to? What is this word Bechukosai? And the sages explain that there's a unique purpose in this word. As a matter of fact, the word wasn't chosen arbitrarily. There was a meaning to every single word in the Torah. Every single word is precise. Here's a text from the great 13th century sage Rabbeinu Bechai, Rabbi Bechai, the son of Asher, and he writes as follows, explaining this term of Bechukotai Chukim. The verse mentions, not our verse, but the verse in general mentions 3 categories of mitzvot, namely rational, traditional, and beyond reason. Mishpatim are rational laws handed down to us from God, whereas edot are traditional rites that bear testimony to God's presence and the creation of the world. Chukim are those statutes that do not have any apparent reason. Now, this categorization is very important. You see, generally speaking, when we speak about the commandments, we say there are commandments, 613 commandments. There are 10 commandments in the 2 tablets, and there are 613 commandments in the Torah. We all know that. But the 613 are actually split into 3 categories. The first category, called mishpatim, are logical commandments. Don't kill, don't steal, etc. Any civilization, a rational civilization, will come up with those laws. Then there are edot, literally means testimonial. They're testimonial laws about God's presence in this world, like Passover, that God took us out of Egypt. It's testimony for that God took us out of Egypt, the mitzvah of matzah, the holiday of Sukkot. These are laws which are testimonial laws. Shabbat, it's testimony to God's presence and God's creation of the world. Then there's the third category, the small category. Not that many commandments fit into that category. What is that category? Chukim, statutes. Those are laws that don't have any apparent reason, any logical reason that we can perceive. Obviously, the divine God has its reason why those laws are applicable, but we don't have any apparent reason. The laws of kosher, the laws of impurity, the law of the red heifer. These are laws that there are no apparent reason for them, and we cannot understand the reason. That is the third category, kind of the most esoteric, the loftiest category. And so when the verse tells us in our Torah portion, in text 1, Im Bechukosai telechu, if you follow my statutes, it's not referring to the commandments in general. It's referring to that specific category, or so it may seem, that it's referring to that specific category. And that category seems to be the hardest of categories, as the Midrash itself, in the book of Numbers, says something very important and very powerful. This is the statute, chukat, of the Torah, because Satan and the nations of the world taunt Israel, saying, what is this commandment and what purpose does it have? Therefore, the Torah uses the term statute. I have decreed it, you have no right to challenge it. It's engraved, which is the actual literal translation of chukah. This is a rule that God, so to speak, figuratively engraved. It's a law that we cannot comprehend, and nonetheless we do it because that's what God wants us to do. And so why use the term Bechukosai here? Why use the term of statutes here? Because God is telling us that it's not just that we receive these rewards if we follow just the statutes. God is telling us something deeper. But God is telling us with this introductory word that when we fulfill any mitzvot, be it from the category of edot, of testimonial laws, be it from the category of mishpatim, the logical laws, don't kill, don't steal, and so on. And of course, the laws of chukim, all of those commandments should be done in a Bechukosai fashion. What does that mean? What does it mean that we should fulfill all the commandments, all 3 categories, in a Bechukosai fashion? This means as follows. Human rationale is a funny thing. Logic, it's a funny thing. If we don't do something, or we do something because of our rationale, then we can stop doing it, or we can go ahead and do the opposite of what we should be doing, also because of our rationale. If we rationalized our way into doing something, the human mind has this funny way of rationalizing the way out of it. And so even something which is simple, if we were doing it solely because that's what our logic tells us to do, then our logic will find a way in certain circumstances to tell us not to do it. Same with a prohibition. If we don't do something because it's the logical thing not to do it, our logic will somehow find a way in certain situations to tell us, hey, this is the logical thing to do. To use a common example that's found in the Rebbe's talks, don't kill. Any normal civilization knows we don't kill. Because if you want to have a normal civilization, you want to have normal people, you want to have people who are able to go shopping and go to the park and go wherever they want. And to have a normal society, you need to implement do not kill. So it's a logical thing. Why do we need Torah to tell it to us? The problem is, it's getting more and more distant, but it's not that distant. We had the German society, who at the time in the 30s, they were from the greatest thinkers of their time, the greatest doctors, the greatest musicians and artists, the greatest theologians, the greatest scientists of their time, the greatest cup mention, as we say in Yiddish. They were the greatest thinkers. But nonetheless, they somehow rationalized their way into killing millions of people. And it wasn't only in Germany. It reached the shores of the United States. If you do some studying from the 30s, it's pretty scary what went on in the halls of academia here in the United States, of rationalizing the murder of various people within the United States, various groups. And it was actually carried out, unfortunately, in the early days. They rationalized all different things which are unthinkable. And so if we rationalize our way into something, we can rationalize our way out. And that's why the Torah is telling us that when we fulfill the commandments, all the commandments we should fulfill, not because we understand, even those simply logical commandments. Why do we do those commandments? Because God said so. Why don't we kill? Because God said not to. Why don't we steal? Because God said not to. Just like, why do we eat kosher? Because God said so. Why do we perform the red heifer in the time of the temple? Because God said so. Once it's coming from God, it's coming from an outside party, so to speak, a third party, then it's not rational. And just like we didn't rationalize our way into it, we're not going to rationalize our way out of it. In the words of the Rebbe, text 4a and 4b. All mitzvot, even rational ones, must be fulfilled not only because we appreciate their reason, but rather because they were given at Sinai with a basic sense of commitment. And here the Rebbe explains two reasons in 4b, not just the reason that I just mentioned, but a second profound reason as well. First, if mitzvah observance is predicated on a personal conviction as to their sound logic, it will ultimately lead to a situation our sages describe. Today, your Yetzer Hara, your evil inclination, tells you to do X. Tomorrow, Y, until you are serving idols outright. The evil inclination is smart. It knows how to work our minds. And so it doesn't come outright and tell us to do something outlandish because we know it's absurd to do such a thing. But it tells us to do Y, X, tells us, then after we get used to that, it tells us to do Y, and then it goes further and gets us to do something outlandish. Because if we rationalize our way into it, then we can rationalize our way out. To explain, and as much as the Yetzer Hara is the one telling you to follow mitzvah, namely, what does it mean? The evil inclination is telling us to follow the mitzvah. We're doing the mitzvah because we know it's the right thing, namely because it makes perfect sense, and not simply because God instructed you to do so. You are essentially unmooring yourself from God. This primes you to thereafter fall ever lower until the very abyss of idolatry. That's the first reason. Second, Mitzvah observance left to rationale alone is missing a critical element of religious life, God. To leave God out of any part of our religious commitment is senseless at best, and as such, everything we do must be undergirded by a sense of blind faith. And the Rebbe continues. Another reason why mitzvah observance must not be predicated on logic and reason alone, even if we argue that the person will indeed fulfill the mitzvot, they will still lack a critical element. The sentiment that they are something from and connect one with God, a part of Torah. So aside from the aspect that by doing mitzvot simply for their rationale, aside from the point that by doing mitzvot simply for their rationale can lead us astray, because if we rationalize our way in, we will rationalize our way out. It will lead us to do things that are unthinkable. Even more than that, it's missing a critical component, the idea that by doing a mitzvah, the mitzvah is something from the Almighty and it connects us with God. One may say that this is even deeper and more important aspect of each mitzvah, regardless of what the mitzvah itself is accomplishing, underlying every single mitzvah. By performing a mitzvah, we are connected to the Almighty. And so every mitzvah, even if it's something as simple as don't kill and don't steal and give charity, every single mitzvah, why do we do it? Because with this mitzvah, we are connected to God Almighty. And so that's the reason why the Torah portion uses the term, if you follow my statutes, but really it's a reference to all the commandments, that if we follow God's commandments, we will be blessed with all the subsequent blessings in the Torah. Because the Torah is teaching us this important lesson that all the commandments we shall do as if they are statutes without any apparent logic, and we do them only because that's what God wants us to do. Seems well. We understand the reason for the name, and we can move right along. But all's not as it seems. Because if you recall, in the verse, that first verse that we quoted from this week's Torah portion, what did we say? Im Bechukosai telechu, if you follow in my statutes, and you will heed my commandments. Is it redundant? Is the Torah telling us something superfluous? Every word in Torah is precise. And in actuality, when it talks about Bechukosai, that's all nice and dandy, and that's all true, the idea that every mitzvah we should do, but this is not where we learn it from. We learn it from a different verse. Because this idea of Bechukosai referring to the mitzvah is contrary to what the sages explain that this verse means. In the words of Rashi, our favorite commentary, quoting from the Talmud, Rashi tells us as follows. If text 5, page 74, if you have the book, if you follow my statutes, and Rashi explains, I might think that this refers to the fulfillment of mitzvot, to the fulfillment of the commandments. However, when scripture says, immediately following that statement, and observe my commandments, mitzvah fulfillment is already stated. So what then is the meaning of if you follow my statutes? It means that you must toil in Torah study. Sorry. So what do we have here? What we have here is that this verse has nothing to do with the commandments. This first line of the verse in Bechukosai telechu, if you follow my statutes, statutes here does not refer to the Torah, to the commandments. It's referring here to the study of Torah, not just the study of Torah, but the toil in Torah study. Which brings us back to square one. And not just square one, but it's even more perplexing than it was until now. Because if it's a reference to Torah, my statutes, and statutes is a term, the Hebrew term, hukah, is used primarily, and it means the laws of the aspect of the Torah that is beyond comprehension, that has no apparent logic. If it's a reference to Torah study, it's an oxymoron. Because Torah study, according to Jewish law, has to be, as it sounds, a study, something we understand. So how can we say that something we understand is something which has no apparent logic? How does that fit together? How can the Torah call Torah study chukah, something which is my statutes beyond logic, beyond comprehension? As a matter of fact, according to Torah, we do not make the blessing on the study of the oral Torah, the Talmud, and the Midrash, etc., etc. All of the oral Torah. If we study it and we do not understand it, we cannot make the blessing on the Torah. Because the blessing on the Torah can only be made when Torah is understood. And if we're going to just do lip service and read the words, we're not fulfilling our obligation of Torah study. Here's a quote from the Code of Jewish Law. When studying the oral tradition, if you do not understand what you're learning, it is not considered Torah study at all. And the blessing, which some of you may be familiar with, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, Baruch Atah Hashem Noten HaTorah, that blessing cannot be made on the study of the oral tradition if we do not understand it. So we're back to square one, and even a more powerful square one. What does Bechukosai, what does chukah, something which is beyond comprehension, how is that used to tell us about the study of Torah? In order to understand this, we're going to do some digging deep into the Hebrew word chukah, which is the root word for Bechukosai, which is the word that we've been discussing all along. What does the word chukah mean? Why is it the term that's used to describe supra-rational laws? There are a number of reasons that are given to explain the association. The literal translation of the word means engraved. That's what chukah means, to engrave. To engrave writing on the tablets, it's called chukah. To engrave writing on a stone, it's called chukah. To engrave on a slab of marble, it's called chukah. That's what the word chukah means. How does that play into statutes which are beyond reasoning? So here we have a quote from the Likutei Torah, one of the early writings of Chassidus of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liad. Text 7. The words, if you follow my statutes, Bechukosai, can be interpreted by means of a metaphor from a vessel that needs to be carved out from the inside. So too, we must carve out a space in the animal soul so it can thereafter follow, namely to mature to a state of love to be included in the oneness of God. Right? The verse says, if you follow my statutes. And in the Hebrew, in the English grammar, it makes sense to say if you follow my statutes, but in the Hebrew, literally translated would be, if my statutes you follow. And so we're explaining, if my statutes you follow, if you carve out a space in your animal soul, then the animal soul can follow what? Follow to mature, follow up to mature to a state of love to be included in the oneness of God. And he explains further. Carving out the inside is accomplished through practical mitzvot of the chukim category. How do we carve out the inside of our animalistic soul, which each one of us possesses? How do we carve out that inside in order to be able to follow the Almighty? We do that by the performance of the carving category, the chukim category, the statutes, the ones that are beyond logic, such as para aduma, the red heifer, tzitzit, and tefillin, which have no logical reason whatsoever. Why is that? How do these commandments accomplish that? This is because these commandments, in fact, stem from a lofty place that is beyond reason. Their divine source is a lot greater than the divine source of the laws that do have logical reason. And it's something that makes perfect sense, because laws which are comprehensible to finite beings are seemingly on a lower level than laws that are incomprehensible to finite beings. They're infinite. They're beyond the super rational. They come from a loftier source, which in turn tells us, continue the reading, they are the raw will of God himself. And it is through these mitzvot, these commandments, that flow from such a lofty space, that a space is carved out inside the animal soul. The soul is engraved with a love for God, for his or her very soul to be included in the oneness of God through these mitzvot. So when we refer to this category of commandments as chukim, as engraved commandments, what we're really saying is it's a reference to the impact these particular commandments have on the person who fulfills them. How's that? What's the impact it has? When a person maintains a deep connection and a deep commitment to something that defies a person's very sense of reason, that carves out in the person a space for God in that person's egoistic self. And that's why these mitzvot, based on their impact, are called chukim. They are engraved, because the Hebrew word chukah means to engrave. It's the impact these commandments have. And now we come back to the study of Torah in such a way. You see, when we study Torah, we can study Torah for various reasons. We can study Torah because a purely academic pursuit. It's interesting. I like it. It's intellectually stimulating. I study Torah because I want to know what I'm supposed to do. I want to know why we put on tefillin. I'd like to know why we keep Shabbos. I'd like to know what the laws of Shabbos are. Those are very logical reasons for the study of Torah. But then there's a third, even deeper reason for the study of Torah, not too different from that third category of the performance of mitzvahs. I want to study Torah because it's God's Torah. It has nothing to do with my intellect. It has to do with this deep, inherent connection that my soul has with the Almighty, and in turn with the Almighty's wisdom, the Torah. And a practical difference between those two categories: if a person is having a hard time understanding, comprehending Torah, or taking to a certain aspect of Torah study, so if their study is merely an academic pursuit, or to know what to do, they'll give up. I'm not enjoying it. It's not reaching the academic aspect of it. It's not for me. But if we study Torah from a chukah way, we study Torah because we want that the Torah should penetrate us. If we commit to Torah in a chukah way, it's not about what I appreciate. It's about studying the divine wisdom. It's about studying the infinite wisdom of the Torah. It's about the chukah aspect of Torah. Then what Torah does, it changes us. It's engraved in our very self. It carves out from our animal soul and deepens that connection with the Almighty. Text 8, page 76, in the words of the Rebbe. When a person studies Torah with true toil, the type of hard work associated with engraving, as opposed to simply writing, it affects a sense of engraving in the heart of the person who studies it. It changes the person. It's engraved in them. If he or she suffers from a heart of stone, should they truly toil in Torah, their stony heart will be penetrated by the rigor of Torah, as the verse states, stones that the water eroded. But if it was just studied as an academic pursuit, that wouldn't happen. That wouldn't be there. And as we know from the famous Rabbi Akiva, the Midrash tells us a fascinating story of the humble beginnings of the great sage Rabbi Akiva, who I'm sure we've all heard of. There are great institutions named for him. One of the greatest sages that ever lived. But he had very humble beginnings. And then the Midrash tells us, how did Rabbi Akiva start off? They said, at 40 years old, he had still not learned anything. Rabbi Akiva knew nothing when he was 40 years old. He knew nothing about Torah. The Talmud tells us elsewhere that he was a farmer. He was a shepherd out in the fields, his father-in-law's fields. What happened? Once he encountered a hole in a rock. Who bore this hole, he asked. It is the water that constantly falls on it every day, they told him. Akiva, are you not aware of the verse, stones that the water eroded? That water can erode stones? Rabbi Akiva immediately made the following calculation. If soft water can eventually penetrate a hard stone, surely Torah, which is strong like iron, can certainly penetrate my heart, flesh, and blood. So he immediately set out to learn Torah. There are many blockages a person can experience when it comes to learning anything new, and of course, when it comes to studying Torah. Sometimes it can be a lack of academic wherewithal. Sometimes it can be a lack of smarts to conquer a complex aspect of the Talmud. And sometimes it can be, like we mentioned here from Rabbi Akiva, a stony heart. Whatever that blockage may be, if we commit to the study of Torah like a chukah, with blind and resolute determination, that comes when we stick to something that we may not even try to understand, or something that we may never understand, but we're going to stick with it till the end, then with that level of determination, we're going to be able to power through it. Because eventually that water, in this case, we're using water as a metaphor for Torah, will penetrate and will perhaps even bore a hole through and through, will penetrate one's mind and one's heart and straight into the soul. And that's what chukah accomplishes. That's why when the Torah tells us, "Im Bechukosai telechem," if you follow my statutes, and it's a reference to Torah study, and seemingly Torah study has to be with our understanding. But Torah study is not an academic pursuit. Torah's study is something that changes us from within. And so when we study Torah, we don't do it for an academic pursuit. We do it because we're going to stick with it. We do it because it's something that is beyond rationale. It's God's Torah. And when we stick with it till the end, even if in some cases it's beyond our rationale, it will eventually bore that hole. But that's not the end. Chassidus gives another reason, an even deeper reason, an angle to this idea that we call Torah study chukah. And that is going back to that initial idea that we explained, that when it comes to the commandments, we have to do them. Even the commandments that we understand, we do them simply because that's what God wants. And so when it comes to Torah study must also be, proper Torah study must also be associated with that which lies beyond reason. In other words, proper Torah study, counterintuitively, is actually not about reason at all. And why is that? There are two layers to this idea. The first one is because raw commitment to Torah study, even if it's something that we don't understand, even if it's something which seems way beyond our reasoning, way beyond our logic, if we have that raw commitment to Torah study, it motivates more study. If it's labeled something which is reason, the minute we approach something and we reach something which is beyond our reason, we'll give up. But if we know that it's beyond our reason, because this is infinite wisdom, we're not going to give up. We're committed to it in a chukah-like way. We're committed to the Torah study in a way that we know that this is what God wants from us. And so I will be committed to it, whether it's something I feel I can understand or not. We're going to stick it to the end. Stick to it till the end. The words of the text end. Bechukosai are the mitzvahs called chukim. In the context of Torah study, this means that our Torah study must be in a chukah-like fashion, namely with raw commitment. While it's true that we must understand Torah with our human intellect, that alone is built on a foundation of faith. Namely, the drive to understand doesn't flow from personal enjoyment, rather simply because God instructed that we must study with our own intellect. Such an attitude leads one to toil in Torah. Namely, they learn beyond their natural tendency. Motivated purely by personal enjoyment, Torah study would be limited to the contours of what a person enjoys and would never lead to true toil. It's the first point, the first layer of why when we study Torah, it must be done in a way which is beyond rational. The second reason is because Torah is the divine wisdom. It's divine wisdom. And so if we look at Torah study as merely academic, as merely something that our human minds can comprehend, we're limiting Torah to what it isn't. We're limiting Torah to our little box. Whereas Torah is infinite wisdom. It can't be limited to the human finite wisdom. In the words of the great 13th century sage, Rabbi Yedaya Pnini, he says it as follows: not even angels are able to perceive the secret of God's words etched into their very being. Certainly then we simple humans cannot dare to perceive or comprehend your greatness. If an angel which has no evil temptations cannot perceive you, certainly we who possess evil urges and at times defy our own creator, we dare not assume that we understand God. How can our understanding, our limited, finite understanding, which can be swatted away like a mosquito, find grace in your eyes to gain any understanding of you? The sum total of what we know is that we don't know you at all. From everything we work so hard to understand, we know only that you exist. And in other words, the great 14th century sage, Rabbi Yosef Alba, in his famed philosophical work, Sefer HaIkarim, from this we may get an idea of the great joy and delight that God has in the apprehension of his own essence. For he has an infinite number of perfections, and each one is infinite in worth. Therefore, no other being can apprehend his essence. It's impossible. As the wise man said when they asked him if he knew the true essence of God, if I knew him, I would be him. In other words, there is no one who comprehends his essence except God, though his existence is evident most plainly to all from his acts. Praise be to him who surpasses us with his perfection, who is hidden from us despite his intense visibility, as the light of the sun and its agreeableness are hidden from those of weak sight. Their defective understanding does not prove his non-existence. The most we can understand about God is that we cannot understand him. As the wise man said, the sum total of what we know of you is that we do not know you. Now, these statements are all said about God himself, that it's impossible to comprehend the Almighty. But it's self-understood that these ideas extend also to God's wisdom. That even God's wisdom, the more we know, the more we see we can't comprehend, because it's infinite wisdom, and only the divine can comprehend his own wisdom. Put beautifully by the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya, text 13, his essence and being and knowledge are all absolutely one. Unlike humans, our essence is one, our being is another, and our knowledge is a third. It's something outside of us, our knowledge. Not with the Almighty. The Almighty's knowledge is one with him. It's a deep Kabbalistic concept that we've discussed a number of times at length, and it's beyond the scope of tonight's class. But suffice it to say that according to Kabbalah, and really rationally speaking, God is everything and God is everywhere. That means even his knowledge is not beyond him, but it's within him. And so his knowledge is one with him without any composition. Therefore, just as it is impossible for any creature in the world to comprehend the essence of the Creator and his being, so it is impossible to comprehend the essence of his knowledge, which is one with God himself. It is possible only to believe with a faith that transcends intellect and comprehension. So what we have here is the second aspect. That when we study Torah, we ought to know not only that when we study Torah with a chukkah-like attitude, we will motivate ourselves beyond our wildest dreams to study more and deeper and farther, because we know that it's not all about us, it's beyond us. But even more than that, if we study Torah simply for the academic pursuit, if we study Torah because I can understand me, a limited, a finite being, then we're placing the divine infinite wisdom in a box. We're limiting it. And how can we limit the divine wisdom? This is infinite wisdom. It's beyond us. And so our attitude towards Torah study has to be the same. And so when we study Torah, we must always remember that by studying Torah, we're studying the divine Torah. And if so, we're connecting with God. Text 14. There are two elements to Torah study. A, studying it with intellectual rigor. And B, the fact that it connects the student with the one who gave the Torah God, which is the sanctity of Torah, the essence of Torah that is beyond our human rationale. It adds a whole new dimension to the study of Torah. It's God's wisdom. And by me studying God's wisdom, if I limit it to my own level, if I limit it to my own intellect, I'm wasting it. Because it's divine, it's infinite. Why limit it? And by having that attitude, we then understand that by studying the Torah, we have this opportunity to connect with the Almighty, because this is His wisdom, which is one with Him. Text 15. If a person assumes that they achieved complete mastery in Torah study, it only demonstrates that they aren't working hard enough. As the previous Rebbe said, even logical parts of Torah must be followed like chukim. Accordingly, it makes perfect sense that the Torah uses the term Bechukosai when talking about Torah study, even though the subject matter is all of Torah, not just the chukim, not just the super rational parts of Torah, but all of Torah. Nonetheless, it's also the Eidot HaMishpatim. It's referring to a super rational, because when a person toils in Torah study, they come to the realization that even Mishpatim are really chukim. We come to the recognition that even those parts of Torah that we do understand is part of the infinite wisdom. And so let's not limit it to our limited understanding. And so this is the reason why the name of our Torah portion, the word that is coming to describe Torah study, is Bechukosai. It's teaching us this important point, that how lucky we are that we were gifted with such a precious gift, the Torah, which is a wisdom like any other. It looks like it's just any other academic pursuit. It looks like it's just like any other subject. But really what it is an opportunity to change ourselves. It's an opportunity to reach beyond ourselves. And most importantly, it's an opportunity to create a profound connection with the Almighty.